When my best friend hinted at a different way to involve my husband in her plans, I expected outrage or jealousy. Instead, I felt something unexpected: control. What she suggested wasn't about desire, but leverage, about shifting dynamics that had quietly trapped me for years. As I listened, I realized this idea gave me clarity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. What began as a shocking proposal became a turning point, forcing me to see my marriage, my friendship, and myself in a completely new light. Sometimes power doesn't come from refusal, but from understanding exactly where you stand. If this story helps you recognize that unconventional perspectives can reveal hidden truths, or gives you courage to reclaim control in your own life, please leave a like and subscribe. There are moments in life when someone says something so unexpected, so outside your normal frame of reference, that it forces you to see your entire situation from a completely different angle. For me, that moment came on a Thursday evening in November, sitting in my best friend Charlotte's living room, when she suggested using my husband's professional skills and connections to expose the man who'd been exploiting her financially and emotionally for 3 years. What she proposed wasn't romantic or sexual, it was strategic, calculated, a way to turn my husband's corporate investigation expertise into a weapon that would free Charlotte from an abusive relationship and simultaneously reveal to me just how trapped I'd been in my own marriage by patterns I'd never questioned. My name is Miranda Lawson, and I'm 39 years old. This story begins 6 months ago when I was still operating under the comfortable illusion that my life was fine. Not perfect, not passionate, but acceptable, stable, the kind of existence you maintain because changing it seems harder than enduring it. I'd been married to James Lawson for 14 years, a relationship that had long since settled into patterns of emotional distance and practical coexistence, rather than genuine partnership. James worked as a corporate fraud investigator for a large consulting firm, traveling frequently, working long hours, maintaining a professional life I had minimal visibility into and even less interest in asking about. Our marriage was characterized by parallel lives that occasionally intersected for logistical coordination, but rarely for emotional connection. We shared a house, raised our 12-year-old daughter Emma together in the practical sense of dividing responsibilities and attending school events, maintained the appearance of a functional family unit, but we didn't really talk anymore, not about anything substantive. We didn't share dreams or fears or vulnerabilities. We existed in the same space while living fundamentally separate emotional lives, an arrangement I'd convinced myself was normal for long-term marriage, the natural evolution of what had once been love into something more like compatible roommates. James's work investigating corporate fraud and embezzlement meant he was skilled at uncovering hidden financial activities, following money trails, documenting deception, and building cases against people who thought they'd successfully hidden their crimes. It was work he was good at, work that paid well, work that gave him a sense of purpose and competence I sometimes suspected he didn't feel in our marriage. He talked about his cases occasionally, usually in vague terms that protected client confidentiality, sharing enough to convey that his work was important and challenging, but not enough for me to really understand what he did or how he did it. I'd stopped asking for details years ago, partly because the technical financial explanations bored me, partly because James seemed to prefer keeping his professional life separate from our home life, partly because I'd grown accustomed to not really knowing much about my husband's daily existence beyond the surface logistics. This emotional distance, this lack of curiosity about each other's inner lives, was something I'd normalized over years of marriage, something I'd stopped questioning because questioning it would require acknowledging how hollow our relationship had become. My best friend Charlotte Martinez had been part of my life since college, nearly 20 years of friendship that had survived moves and career changes and the complications of adult life. She was smart and funny and vibrant, the kind of person who lit up rooms and attracted people effortlessly. But over the past 3 years, I'd watched her become increasingly diminished, trapped in a relationship with a man named Derek Chambers, who I'd disliked from the moment I met him, but who Charlotte seemed unable to leave despite his obvious toxicity. Derek was a successful real estate developer, charming and confident in public settings, someone who presented as generous and attentive to Charlotte when others were watching. But in private, According to what Charlotte had gradually revealed to me over years of late-night conversations and tearful confessions, he was controlling and manipulative, someone who used money and gifts to maintain power over her, who isolated her from friends and family through subtle psychological tactics, who made her feel dependent on him financially and emotionally in ways that made leaving seem impossible. Charlotte had moved in with Derek about 2 years into their relationship, giving up her apartment to save money, becoming financially entangled with him in ways that complicated her ability to leave. He paid for most things: rent, utilities, her car payment, positioning himself as generous provider while actually creating a situation where Charlotte felt she couldn't afford to leave, where the practical logistics of disentangling herself financially seemed overwhelming. He controlled access to money in subtle ways, making her ask permission for purchases, questioning her spending, making her feel guilty about expenses, all while maintaining the appearance of generosity by paying for things himself. The emotional manipulation was even more insidious. Derek would alternate between intense affection and cold withdrawal, keeping Charlotte off balance, never sure which version of him she'd encounter. He'd criticize her appearance and choices while claiming it was helpful feedback meant to improve her. He'd isolate her from friends by making social plans difficult, always having reasons why they couldn't attend gatherings, or why he needed her available when I invited her to things. He'd undermine her confidence systematically, making her feel like she was lucky he tolerated her flaws, like she couldn't do better, like leaving would mean ending up alone and struggling. I'd tried to help Charlotte leave Derek multiple times over 3 years, offering her a place to stay, helping her look at apartments she could afford on her own, encouraging her to see a therapist who could help her understand the abuse dynamics she was trapped in. But every time she seemed ready to leave, Derek would do something to pull her back. Grand romantic gesture, promises to change, threats of what would happen if she left, manipulations that played on her fear and hope in equal measure. I'd grown frustrated watching my brilliant, capable friend remain trapped by a man who was systematically destroying her sense of self and autonomy. The conversation that would change everything happened on a Thursday evening in November. Charlotte had called me that afternoon, her voice tight with stress, asking if she could come over to talk about something important. I'd agreed immediately, told James I was having a friend over, and would he mind giving us privacy, sent Emma to do homework in her room. When Charlotte arrived, she looked exhausted and determined in equal measure, someone who'd made a difficult decision and needed support to follow through with it. "I need to leave Derek," she said without preamble, sitting on my couch and looking at me with red-rimmed eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently. "I've finally realized I can't keep doing this, can't keep letting him control my life and make me feel worthless. But I can't just walk away. He's been stealing from me, Miranda. For 2 years he's been taking money from my accounts, using my credit cards without permission, taking out loans in my name. I didn't realize the extent of it until I finally looked at my credit report last week. I'm over $60,000 in debt that I didn't know about, debt he created using my information. I felt anger rise in me, both at Derek for stealing from Charlotte and at Charlotte for not checking her credit or finances sooner, though I knew the latter feeling was unfair. Financial abuse was part of the pattern of control Derek had established, and victims of such abuse often don't realize the extent of damage until much later. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I asked. "About getting the debt dismissed since it was fraud? Getting police involved? Getting a restraining order?" "I've consulted with a lawyer," Charlotte said, "and she says the debt situation is complicated because Derek and I have been living together in a relationship. Some of the charges were for household things we both benefited from. Proving it was fraud rather than authorized use of shared resources would be difficult. The police are unlikely to pursue it as criminal matter given our relationship context. And a restraining order requires proving threats or violence, which I can't do because Derek's never been physically violent, just financially and emotionally abusive in ways that don't leave evidence." She paused, looked at me directly, said something that would shift everything. "But I've been thinking about James's work, about what he does investigating corporate fraud and financial crimes. What if there was a way to use his skills to document what Derek's done to me, to build a case that's strong enough that Derek would agree to release me from the debts and leave me alone rather than risk exposure?" What if we could turn James's professional expertise into leverage that would actually free me from this situation? I sat back, processing what Charlotte was suggesting. She wanted to use my husband's professional skills, his ability to investigate financial crimes, document evidence, build comprehensive cases against people hiding their wrongdoing, to go after Derek, to expose his theft and manipulation in ways that would force him to release his financial hold on Charlotte. It was an unconventional proposal, using James's work expertise in a personal matter rather than a corporate one, potentially putting him in a position that blurred professional and personal boundaries. My first instinct was to say no, to explain that James wouldn't want to get involved in personal drama, that his professional skills were for his paying clients, not for helping my friends, that asking this would create complications in my marriage I didn't need. But as I started to voice those objections, I stopped, suddenly seeing the situation from a completely different angle. Why wouldn't James help? He investigated fraud for a living, spent his days building cases against people who stole and lied and manipulated. Charlotte was my best friend, someone I cared about, someone being victimized by exactly the kind of financial criminal James dedicated his career to exposing. Wouldn't asking for his help be reasonable, expected even? And as I thought about it more, I realized something uncomfortable. I'd already assumed James would say no, would refuse to get involved, would prioritize his professional boundaries over helping someone I cared about. I'd already accepted that my husband wouldn't do something significant to help me or my friend, even if he had the exact skills needed. That assumption revealed something about our marriage, about the emotional distance and lack of partnership that had become so normalized, I didn't even question it anymore. "You know what?" I said slowly, working through my thoughts as I spoke. "I think that's actually a brilliant idea. James has exactly the skills to document what Derek's done, to build a case strong enough that Derek would have to settle rather than risk exposure or prosecution. And honestly, if James won't help with this, if he won't use his professional expertise to help my best friend escape an abusive relationship when he literally does this kind of investigation for a living, then that tells me something important about my marriage that I need to face." Charlotte looked surprised, perhaps by my sudden enthusiasm or by the personal revelation I'd just voiced. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I don't want to create problems between you and James. If this would cause issues in your marriage, we can figure out something else." But I was already thinking strategically, seeing this not just as a way to help Charlotte, but as a test of my marriage, an opportunity to see whether James and I could actually partner on something meaningful, or whether our emotional distance was so complete that we couldn't even coordinate to help someone we both knew was being victimized. "I'm sure," I said firmly. "Let me talk to James about it. I'll present it as a favor to a friend who's being financially abused and needs help documenting the crimes being committed against her. Let's see if he's willing to help, or if he hides behind professional boundaries to avoid getting involved. Either way, I'll learn something important about where I stand in my own marriage." That night after Charlotte left, I approached James about the situation, explaining Charlotte's financial abuse in clinical terms, describing the debt Derek had accumulated in her name, the theft from her accounts, the manipulative control. I framed it as a straightforward case of financial fraud, exactly the kind of thing James investigated professionally, and asked whether he'd be willing to help Charlotte document the evidence, build a case that would give her leverage to escape the relationship. I watched his face carefully as I explained, looking for his reaction, waiting to see whether he'd engage with this request or dismiss it. James's initial response was exactly what I'd predicted: hesitation, concern about professional boundaries, questions about whether this was appropriate use of his skills, skepticism about getting involved in personal drama. "I investigate corporate fraud," he said. "Companies hire my firm to look into financial irregularities in business contexts. This is a domestic situation, relationship dispute, not really what I do professionally. Maybe Charlotte should just hire a private investigator if she needs evidence. Private investigators cost thousands of dollars Charlotte doesn't have because Derek has stolen her money and trapped her in debt," I said, keeping my voice calm but letting my disappointment show. "You have the exact skills to help her, James. You could document what Derek's done in a week, build a case that would force him to settle. This is a friend of mine, of ours, since you've known Charlotte for 14 years too, who's being financially abused and manipulated. And you're saying you won't help because it's not a corporate client paying your firm? I saw something shift in James's expression. Maybe recognition that his refusal looked selfish and cold. Maybe genuine consideration of the ethical dimensions I was highlighting. Maybe just desire to avoid conflict with me over this issue. Let me think about it, he said. I need to consider whether I can do this in a way that doesn't compromise my professional obligations or create liability issues. Give me a few days to think it through. Over the following weekend, James apparently did think it through, because on Monday evening he told me he'd agree to help Charlotte, but with specific conditions and limitations. He'd conduct a preliminary financial investigation, documenting evidence of unauthorized use of Charlotte's credit and fraudulent debt creation, but only if Charlotte agreed to use the evidence to pursue formal legal action rather than just informal leverage against Derek. James didn't want to build a case that would be used for personal manipulation. He wanted to help Charlotte escape abuse through legitimate legal channels that would hold Derek accountable. The conditions James set revealed something about him I'd forgotten, or perhaps never fully known. He had strong ethical principles about his work, about proper use of investigative skills, about ensuring that evidence was used for justice rather than personal revenge or manipulation. His initial hesitation hadn't been about not wanting to help, but about wanting to help in the right way, in a manner consistent with his professional values. That distinction mattered, changed how I viewed his response, made me realize I'd been too quick to interpret his caution as indifference or selfishness. Charlotte agreed to James's conditions. She wanted to escape Derek through legitimate means anyway, wanted legal protection and formal resolution rather than just informal threats. Over the following 3 weeks, James conducted a thorough investigation into Derek's financial activities, reviewing Charlotte's bank statements and credit reports, tracing unauthorized transactions and fraudulent accounts, documenting the pattern of theft and manipulation. What he uncovered was more extensive than any of us had realized. Derek had stolen over $80,000 from Charlotte over 3 years, had opened credit cards and taken out loans in her name, had manipulated her financial information in ways that constituted clear fraud beyond any gray area of shared relationship expenses. James built a comprehensive case file, documenting every unauthorized transaction, every fraudulent account, every instance of identity theft. He provided expert analysis showing the pattern of financial abuse, explaining how Derek's actions went far beyond normal relationship shared expenses into clear criminal territory. The documentation was professional and thorough, exactly the kind of evidence that would hold up in court or convince Derek's attorney that fighting Charlotte's claims would be futile and expensive. But as I watched James work on Charlotte's case, coming home with updates, discussing strategy and evidence, showing genuine investment in helping my friend escape her abusive situation, I realized something that changed my entire perspective on our marriage. James was capable of partnership, of investing himself emotionally in something beyond his own work and interests, of using his skills for purposes he cared about. The distance in our marriage wasn't about his inherent inability to connect. It was about patterns we'd both fallen into, about my own failure to ask him for help or partnership because I'd assumed he wouldn't provide it, about both of us choosing parallel lives rather than integrated partnership. Watching James help Charlotte, I saw him animated and engaged in ways I hadn't seen in years. He talked about the case with passion, expressed genuine anger about what Derek had done to Charlotte, showed investment in the outcome beyond just completing an assignment. This was who James could be, involved, caring, using his considerable talents for purposes that mattered personally. I'd stopped seeing this version of him because I'd stopped asking for it, stopped believing our marriage could include this kind of partnership. The evidence James gathered gave Charlotte the leverage she needed to escape Derek finally and completely. Her attorney used the case file to negotiate a settlement where Derek agreed to pay off all the fraudulent debt he'd created, provide Charlotte with a significant financial settlement for the theft and emotional harm, and sign a legal agreement never to contact her again. Derek's attorney recognized that fighting would mean criminal prosecution and professional consequences for Derek's real estate license, making settlement the only viable option. Charlotte moved out of Derek's house into an apartment she could afford, finally free after 3 years of financial and emotional captivity. The transformation in her was immediate and striking. The confidence and vibrancy I remembered from college returning. The diminished and anxious person she'd become while with Derek fading away. She sent James a long, heartfelt thank you letter, expressing gratitude for the professional skill and personal investment he'd brought to helping her escape, acknowledging that without his help, she'd still be trapped. But the real transformation was in my own perspective on my marriage and my life. Charlotte's proposal to use James's skills had forced me to confront dynamics I'd been avoiding. My own assumptions about my husband's availability and willingness to partner, my acceptance of emotional distance as inevitable, my resignation to a marriage that was functionally roommates rather than genuine partnership. Seeing James engage so fully with Charlotte's case made me realize our marriage could be different if I was willing to actually ask for what I wanted, to demand partnership rather than accepting parallel existence. I started asking James for things I'd stopped asking for years ago: his opinion on decisions I was making, his help with projects and problems I'd gotten used to handling alone, his emotional investment in issues I cared about. And to my surprise, he responded positively, seemed almost relieved to be invited back into partnership, to have his skills and perspective valued, rather than existing in the separate professional sphere I'd mentally consigned him to. We started having actual conversations about substantive things, not just logistics and schedules, but thoughts and feelings and perspectives. The process wasn't smooth or easy. 14 years of emotional distance and parallel living doesn't resolve quickly, and both of us had to confront our own roles in creating and maintaining patterns that had left us essentially strangers sharing a house. We started marriage counseling, working with a therapist who helped us understand how we'd each contributed to the distance, how my assumptions about James's unwillingness to engage had become self-fulfilling prophecies because I'd stopped asking, how his retreat into professional life had been partly response to feeling unwanted in our personal life. James revealed things I hadn't known, hadn't asked about in years, that he felt I'd lost interest in him beyond his function as co-parent and financial provider, that he'd immersed himself in work partly because he felt undervalued and unnecessary in our marriage, that he'd stopped offering help and partnership because his offers had been declined or dismissed so many times he'd assumed I didn't want his involvement. My assumption that he wouldn't help Charlotte had been based on patterns I'd helped create, assumptions that had become reality through years of not asking, not inviting, not building partnership. I had to confront my own role in our marriage's hollowness, how I'd stopped being curious about James's inner life, how I'd accepted surface-level coexistence rather than demanding emotional intimacy, how I'd built parallel life rather than fighting for integrated partnership. The comfortable resignation I'd felt about our marriage, the assumption that this was just how long-term marriage looked, had been my own choice to stop trying, to stop asking, to stop believing better was possible. The work of rebuilding partnership after years of parallel existence was challenging, requiring both of us to be vulnerable in ways we'd avoided for years, to ask for what we needed rather than assuming requests would be rejected, to invest emotional energy in each other rather than retreating to separate corners. But it was also revealing, showing us that the foundation we'd built in our early marriage wasn't completely eroded, that partnership was still possible if we chose it deliberately rather than expecting it to happen automatically. 6 months after Charlotte's initial proposal to use James's skills to escape Derek, my marriage looks and feels fundamentally different. We're not perfect, not suddenly transformed into passionate romantic partnership, but we're actually partners now in ways we haven't been in years. We talk about things that matter, ask for help and offer it, invest in each other's lives and concerns, operate as team rather than parallel individuals. Emma has noticed the change too. Commented that her parents seem happier, that we talk more, that we seem to actually like each other rather than just coexisting. The impact on her of seeing her parents in genuine partnership rather than resigned coexistence is something I hadn't fully considered, but that I now recognize as valuable, modeling for her what marriage can be rather than what we'd been showing her for years. Charlotte's situation also transformed in ways beyond just escaping Derek. The experience of being helped, of watching James use his professional skills for personal purposes that mattered, of seeing friendship translated into concrete action, changed how she thinks about asking for help and building support systems. She's been more open with other friends about past struggles, more willing to ask for help when she needs it, more confident in her judgment, and less willing to accept minimizing of her concerns or needs. The unexpected aspect of this entire experience was how Charlotte's shocking proposal, using my husband's skills to go after her abusive ex, became the catalyst for me reclaiming control in my own marriage, for recognizing that I'd been trapped not by James's unwillingness to partner, but by my own assumptions and resignation. What had seemed like a proposal about Charlotte's situation was actually an invitation to examine my own, to see dynamics I'd normalized and accepted, but that weren't inevitable or necessary. The power I'd felt when Charlotte first proposed her idea, the sense of control and clarity, came from finally seeing my marriage from outside the patterns I'd been trapped in. The proposal forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding. Would my husband help someone I cared about? Did we operate as partners or as separate individuals? Was the emotional distance in our marriage something James created, or something we'd both built through years of not asking, not trying, not believing partnership was possible? Understanding exactly where I stood, seeing clearly the dynamics that had seemed normal but were actually resignation, gave me power to change them. Not through confrontation or ultimatum, but through choice. Choosing to ask rather than assume refusal. Choosing to invite partnership rather than accepting parallel existence. Choosing to believe better was possible rather than accepting comfortable mediocrity. My name is Miranda Lawson. I'm 39 years old, and in a 14-year marriage that nearly died from neglect and resignation before my best friend's unconventional proposal to use my husband's professional skills revealed the patterns I'd been trapped in. What began as a plan to help Charlotte escape financial abuse became the catalyst for me reclaiming agency in my own life, transforming a marriage I'd accepted as adequate into partnership I'd stopped believing possible. Sometimes power comes not from refusing what's proposed, but from understanding exactly where you stand and choosing to stand somewhere different. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you recognize that unconventional perspectives can reveal hidden truths or gave you courage to reclaim control in your own life, please like and subscribe.